Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for an engaging webinar presentation on bullying prevention, building a culture of respect. My name is Maria Noesi, and I will be your moderator this afternoon. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping rules. First, the presentation will be recorded. A copy of the recording will be sent after the presentation. Attendees are in listen-only mode, so you are able to hear us, but we're unfortunately unable to hear you. However, you have a questions box on the right-hand side of your interface that you can use to submit questions or comments throughout the presentation. Please do so, where we've reserved time at the end dedicated so that all of the presenters can answer any and all of the questions that you have. Last, I want to say that if you're on social media, please connect with us. So we can connect with us on Twitter and ask questions through there using the @Cognito handle or the #CognitoWebinars. Before I introduce the presenters, I'd like to just introduce a little bit about who Cognito is and why we're hosting this webinar. Cognito is a health simulation company that believes in the power of conversation to inspire and inform, impact how people think, act, evoke empathy, and change lives. We do a lot of work with school districts, higher education institutions, and healthcare organizations to really prepare and equip anyone from educators to students to the staff on how to have conversation about difficult topics and really that can lead to impact in real life. So any topic including bullying prevention, trauma-informed practices, mental health, and suicide prevention. Today we're really excited to have a panel of experts who are going to share insights on how they're currently addressing bullying in their communities, as well as provide a macro perspective on curbing bullying to improve school climate. Our first presenter is Kathleen Miller, who is a Senior Client Success Manager and supports the K-12 clients across the country for Cognito. She has a background in education and has previously supported teachers and districts as they strive to use media and technology effectively in the classroom. Kathleen is joining us from the ATL, where she lives with her husband and 3-year-old little boy, Jude. Kathleen has worked closely with our client at Broward County with Amy on the implementation of a bullying simulation for all of the teachers and staff. And she has been doing a tremendous effort in the state of Florida to train all of the educators in Florida with our mental health and suicide prevention simulation. We are also joined this afternoon by Brendan Lang, who has been a New York City public high school teacher for 15 years, and he has served as a program manager of school culture and climate for the Department of Education's Office of Safety and Youth Development for the past 3 years. In his current role, Brendan helps oversee the DOE's Respect for All program, working to create and maintain school communities free of harassment, discrimination, intimidation, and bullying. Also in compliance with New York State Dignity for All Student Act, Brendan establishes and administers the schedule of the DOE's Respect for All training for school-based staff on how to best identify and address bullying and bias-based behavior in schools. In addition, he manages the professional database to ensure that all data is current and accurate. Finally, but definitely not least, we're joined by Randy Ross, who is a senior policy and practice consultant. Randy Ross has spent the last 45 years as an educator. She is currently a consultant working primarily with nonprofits, state departments of education, and school districts. Randy has focused on reducing bullying and harassment and improving school climate for nearly 20 years. She's on the steering committee of the Social Emotional Learning Alliance for Massachusetts and the National Advisor to Social Emotional Learning for Alliance for the U.S. Additionally, she has served as a subject matter expert in numerous Cognito simulations. So I am very pleased to have these 3 individuals join us today for a great conversation, which I hope all of our attendees will also engage with us. And so with that, I'd like to kick it off and introduce Kathleen, who will kick off today's conversation. Kathleen, take it away.
Hi, thank you guys for joining us. As Maria said, I am presenting for Amy Wood, who is the prevention specialist in the School Climate and Discipline Department in Broward County, Florida, and I'm excited to join you. So, Maria, you can go ahead and click to that second slide. There you go, next one. Oh, so Broward County Public School Climate and Discipline Department's goal is to lead the change for all students in achieving lifelong academic, behavioral, social, and emotional success. The goal is achieved by providing essential services, supports, and resources from the 6 strands of prevention and intervention using a multi-tiered system of support embedded in the response to intervention model to ensure that they are delivered in increasingly higher intensity as school staff and students' needs dictate. You can go to the next one, Maria. There you go. SC&D's 6 strands of prevention and intervention are diversity, health and wellness, instructional strategies, substance abuse prevention, violence prevention, and multi-tier system of supports and academic and behavioral supports. You can go to the next slide. Each of these strands has subject areas, and every subject area has numerous resources to provide academic, behavioral, as well as social and emotional development. Bullying prevention and intervention falls under the violence prevention strand. And Maria, you can click just one click there. As a part of the district's bullying prevention efforts at Tier 1, all district staff, students, and parents are provided a mandatory annual training on bullying as per the district's anti-bullying policy 5.9. And you can click one more time. During the last 10 years, SC&D has created and used various methods to ensure approximately 270,000 students and over 30,000 staff were trained in the most engaging manner possible. But the majority of the trainings were click and play formats, and much like a voiceover PowerPoint. Not being truly interactive, SC&D wanted a better method to ensure that the staff were actively participating in the training. Next slide. In our search, SC&D came across Building Respect, Bullying Prevention in Schools by Cognito. One element SC&D was impressed with was the content's relevance in addressing the district's protected categories. For example, a scenario in Building Respect involves a student using biased language against a non-native English speaker. Another involves speaking with a colleague who did not report a bullying incident involving a transgender student. Next slide. A second course characteristic that impressed SC&D was its interactivity. Users are asked to choose and learn from appropriate versus inappropriate responses as they move through the course. Finally, the fact that teachers receive a personalized certificate upon completion and reports of successful completers can be convinced SC&D that this course would greatly improve our bullying prevention efforts. SC&D approached Cognito in the hopes that they could provide our district with valuable resources and rolled it out to the schools this year. Next slide. To date, approximately 14,000 staff have taken this course, and the responses have been extremely positive. The pre and post survey data made it overwhelmingly clear that staff members felt more prepared to address bullying. But did those feelings of preparedness translate into real action? 2 months after the training, BCPS school staff shared their experiences with bullying and that they did handle situations differently because of what they learned in the simulations. Overall, Broward County staff members believe that the simulation training will have a positive impact on school climate. Over 95% of respondents believe that the school learning environment will become more supportive and classroom safety will improve. SC&D is grateful to Cognito for partnering with Broward schools to help give our staff the knowledge and skills they need to help prevent bullying and create safer, more respectful schools where all students can achieve lifelong academic, behavior, and social emotional success. Next slide. Yep, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Brendan Lang, who will take the next portion.
Hi, good afternoon.
Brendan, take it away.
Yeah, hi. Yes, thanks. So again, I know Maria said earlier, my name is Brendan Lang. I'm a teacher assigned with the New York City Department of Ed, Department Office of Safety and Youth Development. My role now as teacher assigned is part of my role anyway is overseeing the Respect for All initiative in New York City's Department of Ed, which I'll talk about in a minute. Next, please, Maria. So this slide, just to give some background in New York State and New York City about the initiatives to prevent and address bullying, it's really in reverse chronological order. The Respect for All program in New York City was really the seeds of which were sown in the aftermath of 9/11/2001. It became part of DOE and Chancellor's regulation later in 2007 and 2008. The idea was to protect students and provide a learning environment free of harassment and bullying. New York State followed suit several years later with the Dignity for All Students Act, which clarifies some of the language and makes this a state initiative as well. Next slide, please. So some of the things, in addition to the Cognito piece that New York City is doing to address and prevent bullying, one, there are two main regulations, Chancellor's regulations A831 and A832, that address sexual harassment and student-to-student harassment and bullying. These regulations have been around since 2008, like I said, but this year they've enhanced them and clarified some of the language. Also recently, we've expanded the avenues that parents and students and community members have for reporting bullying. Currently, parents could call 311. They can report it in person at the school. They can email Respect for All at schools.nyc.gov, or they can use an online link that reports bullying directly to the schools. There's also escalation protocols now in place. So for parents who feel that their child is being bullied, and they also feel that the school, for whatever reason, is not responding as they should, they can click on this escalation protocol link to loop in senior personnel in the field office to help the schools address the allegations. Also, students that are the substantiated target of more than one bullying incident can receive an automatic safety transfer. And students that, again, that are the substantiated target of more than one incident, schools are required to put an individualized support plan in place to ensure that these students are safe. In addition, this year we've expanded an SEL curriculum for all elementary schools. So elementary schools that already have an SEL curriculum are free to keep that. For those that do not have an explicit SEL curriculum, the Sanford Harmony program has been offered system-wide. We've expanded the Restorative Practices program. It started a couple of years ago in a district in Brooklyn. We saw the results that we were looking for, so it's been expanded throughout New York City. And then lastly, what I'll talk about now, and the webinar is about, is the Cognito Building Respect RFA conversation and online anti-bias training. Next, please, Maria. So the DOE had worked with Cognito before, but how my department came to approach Cognito for this training was with funding from the New York Jets. The New York Jets have their own PR and anti-bullying arm called Stomp Out Bullying. So they offered to partner with us in how to address bullying in New York City schools. And really, despite what they've done on the field this year, they've been great partners to us. So the idea was to spread awareness of New York City protocols surrounding bullying to entire school communities. New York City serves over 1.1 million students, and there's approximately 1,800 schools. So the climate and cultures of these schools, as you might imagine, kind of runs the gambit. Some are great, some maybe not so great. What Chancellor's Reg A832 says, I meant to state earlier, is that, and DASA as well, is that each school must have an RFA liaison or a DASA liaison throughout New York State, who's the point person at that school for addressing bullying. That person has to take a mandatory permanent 2-day training, but it's tough in New York City because principals have to release the personnel from school for 2 days. So the Cognito training has been serving as a supplement to that training. Like I said, because it's an online training, it's easier for school personnel to complete. They can do it during the school day or on their own time, and principals don't have to release staff for 2 days and get substitutes and things of that nature. Similar to what Kathleen was saying in Florida, really the survey data for the Cognito training has been overwhelmingly positive. I oversee the in-person trainings in which we message the Cognito training as well, and all the anecdotal, all the feedback I get in person is great. Similar to what Kathleen put up, for all the relevant fields, we get about 95% of the people saying that they feel more informed about how to address bullying in their school, and 95% as well say they're more informed about how to support students who are being bullied. And then 95% say they would probably, I don't know, I think maybe the most telling question, 95% of the successful completion users say that they would recommend the training to a colleague. Next, please. So how we message the training to staff who are a lot of times already overwhelmed with new initiatives. Well, we post the training in P Weekly. P Weekly is a weekly email that principals get, alerting them to things in the different areas of New York City Department of Ed. And in all the in-person Respect for All trainings that we do, we follow up with post-training emails, bringing to light certain resources, including the Respect for All training. The New York Jets have been giving school incentive visits as well. So each month we parse through the data of schools with the highest percentage of completion of their staff. The Jets reach out. The top 5 schools get 25 tickets to a Jets home game for students or staff or parents. And then the winning schools gets a visit from a retired or current New York Jet. It's like a school assembly where the Jet gets up there and talks about his experiences being bullied, and then they give out footballs. It's interactive. Kids love it. There's also in New York City mandatory PD times during the school day. Generally takes place on Monday and Tuesday. We've been messaging to principals that this is a good time for them to have their staff go to the computer lab and complete this online training. And then lastly, we target schools using the data that we get from student surveys or the rates of material incidents, essentially bullying incidents, schools with high numbers of bullying incidents, or schools in which the student survey indicates where bullying is taking place. We target those schools to message this training as a good way to address those issues. In some cases, the superintendents have required school staff to take the training. Next, please.
Thank you very much, Brendan, for your presentation. Last but not least, I'd like to hand it over to Randy Ross. And I also want to encourage all of the panelists, the attendees on the line to submit questions. I see a couple of questions coming in, but submit questions so that we can make the last portion of the presentation very engaging. Randy, take it away.
Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be on this webinar with the other 2 great presenters, and it's very exciting to me to hear how the simulations are being used. And I say that in part because I helped to develop a number of different simulations, but particularly I worked on the one that was sponsored by the New York Jets. So the 2 examples that were given, the 2 shots, one of the classroom and one of 2 teachers talking, I worked on those simulations. Like, oh, wow, sometimes it feels great when you know you've done something and then you find out lots of people have been using it and they really liked it. So I want to congratulate those people who've, my 2 co-presenters who've been supporting Cognito's work in particular schools. Excuse me. So I've been working in the field of bullying and harassment for many years. I started out working in New Jersey back in the early 2000s, and I've watched the field develop quite a bit over time. one of the most important changes that's happened has been the research that supports the idea that improving school climate is really essential to reducing bullying. There are a number of other factors, and I'm going to thank you for moving to that slide. There are a number of other factors that I'm going to talk about, but the biggest one, sort of the major big picture factor, is school climate improvement. Much of my work is with you can go to the next slide, please. Much of my work is with the National School Climate Center, which the group of people there helped to originate the definition for school climate and have done a great deal of work on bullying issues over several decades. They're also based in New York, and I think they've worked with the New York City schools in a variety of ways. So this particular slide, very simple. The point of the double arrow, I guess is the right way to describe it, of the double arrow is to suggest that school climate improvement and bullying and harassment improvement are really deeply interconnected. You cannot have school climate improvement without also reducing through prevention methods bullying and harassment. But you also, and this is more specifically to the point I'm trying to make here, you cannot reduce bullying and harassment or work on prevention without improving school climate. And that's what a lot of the research has focused on. And I'm going to give a few examples, not so much to dig into the research, but a few specific examples a little bit later. Next slide, please. So as I just mentioned, there's extensive research that shows that improving school climate is one of the major ways of reducing bullying and harassment. And I'm going to offer some definitions to support that in a few minutes. Social emotional learning, we all are hearing quite a bit now about social emotional learning. Perhaps you've been to some of the conferences or worked with CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. That organization has essentially defined for many other organizations and for schools how we should be looking at SEL, and I have their famous, well-known wheel in a later slide. But social emotional learning really does have a specific kind of contribution to reducing bullying. While SEL is a key component of school climate, if I were going to look at school climate overall, I would say that of the many factors, and there are some others, but of the many factors that make up school climate, that social emotional learning is probably the major one that directly affects bullying. And when we get to the slide with the wheel, I'll say more about that. But there are other aspects of school climate that reinforce conditions that make students feel safe. And here are just a few of those. Clear and consistent rules and norms, and these are generally based on the policies in the school district. I believe that Brendan referred to this in his presentation when he talked about both state laws and also policies and procedures that are specific to the New York City schools. That is a really important component of bullying prevention. I actually did a number of years of work with school districts around developing policies. I did a lot of work with the Office of Civil Rights in the New England region, and when school districts had a complaint against them for something having to do, let's say, with sexual harassment or racial harassment, which are forms of bullying, I would go in and help. I would be asked to go in and help school districts to revise their policies and to train their staff on those policies. So while the kind of simulations that Cognito produces are really, really helpful for direct training of how to interact with others, whether it's students or teachers, to reduce bullying, kind of more of an on-the-spot approach, still an overall knowledge of what the policies and procedures are for reporting is still really critical. When we talk about relationships, which I think is the component that's connected very much to social emotional learning and also to school climate, I'd focus in particularly on the need for supportive adult relationships, and then obviously supportive peer relationships. Supportive adult relationships suggests that students are feeling comfortable reporting to adults, whether it's a teacher or a counselor, or it could be a custodian or someone who works in the cafeteria. All of the adults in the school need to understand the ways in which they can support students so that students can they can support students so that students can report to them and feel comfortable and confident. One of the things we know from research and from direct experience is that students are less likely to report to adults if they don't feel that adults will take their concerns seriously, and if they don't feel that adults will be able to do something about the bullying that they may experience or the bullying they may observe with happening with other students. Supportive peer relationships is also really critical. It's less what Cognito has been focusing on, but it's a very important aspect of bullying prevention. It's where we get into the idea of bystanders versus upstanders. Bystanders being those students who observe and may participate or may not participate in the bullying, but they don't actually do anything to intervene. Upstanders is the term, and by now you've probably all heard this term. Upstanders are students, and it can be adults as well, but I'm talking about students here, where students actually will intervene in some way. If the intervention might be reporting to an adult, which gets back to supportive adult relationships, it may be just letting the target or targets know that they feel badly about what's happening, or it may be an actual direct intervention where they tell the person who is who is acting as a bully. I never say the student is a bully. The student who is acting or has bullying behavior, letting that student know that that's not acceptable behavior. Next slide, please. So I want to bring particular attention to cyberbullying. There's tremendous work that's been going on nationally, particularly from an organization based in Florida called the Cyberbullying Research Center. You can Google that and see the range of tremendous materials that they have. There's research that also shows, just as we know that improving school climate can reduce bullying, or does reduce bullying in some of the ways that I was just talking about, there's also research now that shows that improving school climate reduces cyberbullying, which is much harder to address. There's various research over the last years. Some says, well, bullying was going down until about 2015, and then it seems to have gone up in research from 2016 to 19. So I'm not quite sure what I believe or whether that's the truth. It went down, it went up. But the research shows that cyberbullying has not decreased over the last decade, and in fact may be increasing. The fact that it's not increasing more than it is, or that it is staying steady, at least means that we're having some impact, because we know that the plethora of opportunities that students now have on the range of social media tools and site apps, that's the word I'm looking for, really does give too much opportunity for students to get involved in cyberbullying. But the specific research I'm referring to, one point says that students who have experienced cyberbullying, both as a target and as the person doing the cyberbullying, that when students who have experienced it perceived a poorer climate at their school than those who had not experienced cyberbullying in either of those roles. So even though cyberbullying may very well happen out of school, the fact of school climate and the quality of the climate does impact students' sense of their own connection to the school, their peer relationships, etc. And then sort of the other aspect of that is social emotional learning, which again, I think is a critical component of school climate. Improves students' interpersonal relationships, and if it improves their interpersonal relationships, it seems to have an impact on cyberbullying, on reducing cyberbullying as well. So there are a couple of research studies behind those, and I wanted to point those out to really emphasize that cyberbullying is something that we can get a handle on. It's not it's hard to get a handle on cyberbullying, but it can be done, and improving school climate is a critical way to do that. Next slide, please. So what is school climate? I keep talking about it. Here is the standard definition that is very, very widely used across the country. There are some variations on this, but this is essentially what it's about. School climate refers to the quality and character of school life. It is based on patterns of people's experience of school life, and it reflects, and then you have a whole set of things here which are really about the domains of school climate. So norms, which I already referred to, goals, values, interpersonal relationships, which I referred to, teaching and learning, that is a lot about what happens in the classroom, but also the way we teach about behavior expectations, leadership practices, and organizational structures. And those last two get into the way adults in schools, staff in various positions, feel about their experience in the school. And that may be about staff relationships, it may be about relationships with leaders, etc. So it's a very packed definition, and it can be useful just to have a PLC or a staff meeting, just letting people unpack what that definition means. It's a good exercise and a good way to learn about school climate. Next, please. Excuse me. Okay, so I've already talked a little bit about improving school climate. I focused a little bit on social emotional learning and on I mentioned social emotional learning and clear rules and norms. I mentioned relationships, and that's where this whole issue of support from adults and support from peers really is about connectedness to school, and especially to at least one adult and two other peers. One aspect of school climate that we still do not pay enough attention to, but that was mentioned by the other speakers, is the whole issue of respect for diversity and differences. And I'm going to, if I have time in a few minutes, I'm just going to talk about what we mean by legally protected classes, which relates to the term harassment. But here I want to just mention a couple of pieces of research that I've been engaged in. The National School Climate Center has a project working with 5 middle schools in a southern state, and we're now in year 2 of that project. And so in year 1, we used our own bullying survey, and the bullying survey was essentially a bias-based bullying survey. There were 13 categories. Some of them would be considered under, actual harassment, sexual harassment, racial harassment, but there were a number of other categories that are not among the legally protected classes. And 2 of them showed up across the 5 schools. This is from a bullying survey taken by students. The 2 top areas, top in, not in a good sense, but top in that they were the ones that students said they were the most bullied categories. And that was body shape and size and academic performance. So I just want you to kind of tuck that away in your brains to think about how you've observed that in your schools. And you can contact me for more information if you're interested. And then the last area here that's critical to school climate and to reducing bullying and harassment is youth engagement. Adults learn a great deal from students, and listening to students is critical to helping them move from being passive bystanders to active upstanders. Next slide, please. So this is the castle wheel that I was referring to before. I think that most of those of you on the webinar have seen this at some time, at some point. As I've been saying, social emotional learning is critical to reducing bullying. There are programs, specific programs geared for students that are social emotional learning programs, and their particular goal is to reduce bullying. But there are also many, many wonderful social emotional learning programs out there which focus on building and improving a classroom culture. The self-awareness and self-management categories here are very critical for students who, excuse me, who may be themselves acting as bullies or being tempted to act as bullies, and also for targets who might consider a retaliatory response to being bullied. Social awareness and relationship skills are more focused, obviously, on the social environment. They're not so internally focused. And obviously, there are aspects of those that are going to be critical to bullying, to reducing bullying. There are almost any good social emotional learning program worth its salt is going to help to bring issues of bullying to the surface, because students will feel more comfortable talking about it, but also to help to reduce the behaviors. Next slide, please. Okay, the last points that I want to make here in my 2 minutes or 3 minutes that are left is to talk about the importance of rules, norms, expectations in the context of policies. So all 50 states now have, and it used to be 49, but at some point, the last holdout, recently the last holdout state passed a law. So all 50 states now have laws that address bullying issues. And I don't know if it's every single one of those 50 laws, but certainly most of them require that school districts have a bullying policy. They do not necessarily require, however, these laws do not necessarily require that all schools have harassment policies. And in my next slide, next couple of slides, I'm going to explain what the difference is there. But I bring that up because I've worked with districts where they have a very loose bullying policy, and the language kind of generally covers harassment, but without making a clear distinction. Also, all schools have discipline policies, but are those discipline policies aligned with the bullying and harassment policies? It's important that all adults in a school district have some training on the policies, which also would include the procedures for reporting. And it's out of that kind of training that school leaders can really make clear and reinforce what the rules, norms, and expectations are for the school. Next slide, please. So here's just a couple of points about how to use those policies. They should be used to clearly and consistently communicate the rules about bullying behavior, including cyberbullying. And cyberbullying can get legally a little complicated because it happens often, not always, but usually happens outside of school. If it happens in school, if it's done in school on school equipment, etc., or even on a cell phone in school, then there's really no issue about whether it would be covered under policies. But the general approach now about cyberbullying is, and the rule is, that if cyberbullying happens outside of school, on a home computer, or kids probably use computers less than their phones now, so from their phones off of school grounds, then they can, as long as it has some impact in the school, whether on the target or on bystanders, etc., then it's definitely within the purview of school discipline. The policies also can and should state clearly the norms around what is positive student behaviors, respect, kindness, empathy, etc. And those, of course, tie back into social emotional learning. So expressing norms that are based in social emotional learning values are important for expressing what the norms should be. And then also, particularly in terms of procedures that are connected to policies, there should be clear and consistent expectations about adult interventions. New York City, from Brendan's presentation, clearly has a very full range and of ways in which adults should, not only can, but should intervene and support students who are being targeted. Okay, I think the next slide, it might be my last one. No, but next slide. Let me know when I'm going on too long. So here's a set of questions. I won't actually go through these. You'll get a copy of this. These are some questions 6 questions here that you can ask yourself and your colleagues about your own policies and procedures. I think these are questions which will help you think more deeply about this issue. Next slide, please. These are the bullying behaviors that we generally identify, and I don't think anything will be too new to you here, but I do want to, I've mentioned cyberbullying, the others are pretty standard in almost any policy we have. But I do want to mention the last bullet of social exclusion. That's a really hard one, and not necessarily one that you can discipline over. That is, so and so, Jane was not invited to Mary's birthday party. Well, there's no discipline that's involved in that, or should be involved in that. However, it is an opportunity for students to to build empathy. This might be a place where a restorative circle, not necessarily restorative practices in the discipline sense, but a restorative circle might be used within a classroom, or it may be some role for an adult to help a group of students work things out. Social exclusion is very tied to issues of relationship bullying, not exactly the same, but it often one blends into the other. So I wanted to just highlight that issue as a form of bullying behavior. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this slide is an attempt to clarify an area in the field which is a bit confusing to most people. We hear the term bullying, we might hear the term bias-based bullying, and then we hear the term harassment. Well, how do they relate to each other? So my circle within a circle within a circle graphic here is an attempt to explain that. So the definition of bullying, which I have on, I think the next slide. Yes, the next slide after this is, just keep it here though, is a generally accepted definition. It actually, I've been working in the field long enough that I actually know this. It took about a decade or more to come to agreement by people who were writing policies and working in this field to agree on the key elements. And there's 4 key elements, which I'll talk about on the next slide, as to what bullying is. I put cyberbullying in there because I keep referring to it because we know it is one of our biggest issues. So a general bullying policy should be covering the definition, which we'll look at in a moment, and it should definitely incorporate and include a definition of cyberbullying and make clear to the school community that cyberbullying itself is an area that the policy covers, and therefore that discipline can cover as well. The next circle is a little bit narrower, a little bit smaller, because the basis for for students being targeted is, it's generally described as any identifying characteristic. So that's where I mentioned before, for example, academic performance and body shape and size. In the research that I've been doing with these 5 middle schools, this showed up as 2 top categories. There can be other socioeconomic status, for example, is one. I mean, people have said this to me for years. You can talk about sexual harassment, racial harassment, but it seems like most of what students do, or an awful lot of what students do when they're bullying, is bully others in some way related to socioeconomic status. It could be about clothes. It could be about where they live. It could be about, what part of town they live in. Do they live in a trailer? It could be about a whole range of aspects of a child's characteristics that are related to their socioeconomic status. It could be about what kind of work their parents do, etc. That's one particular example, and that's usually pretty high up on the list of socioeconomic status, along with academic performance and body shape and size, is usually pretty high up on the list of specifically identifying characteristics that fall under bias-based bullying. When we get to discriminatory harassment, we're actually looking at a more narrow category, and the categories or the motivations for bullying or harassment based on race, color, religion, national origin or ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Usually we put those together, and disability. Those are the 7 categories that are covered by a variety of federal and state laws. So there are federal laws that cover many of them, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the sexual harassment is covered under the 1972 amendments, education amendments, and disability under ADA and Section 504. So those have federal laws behind them. There's definitely different interpretations, particularly around sexual harassment and whether that covers sexual orientation harassment. That's under the last administration, that was very clear. Under this administration, it's getting a little bit less clear, but I won't go there. I won't go there. But state laws also define the groups that are covered by state harassment laws, also define those protected classes. Next slide, please. So here's that bullying, that simplified bullying definition that I was referring to. So intentionally harmful or hurtful, intention is an issue, unprovoked, repeated, and I'll say in a moment why usually, an imbalance of power and or social status. When people come to me and they say, oh, people in schools, my biggest problem is that everybody is using bullying. They throw it around. Everything's bullying. What I do is I direct them to use this definition, almost like a checklist. You could put it on a card. You could put it in your office. You could hand it out. So that when somebody comes to you, whether it's a student or a parent or even a teacher, and says, I saw this bullying happened, it happened to me, go through the questions. And often the first 3 questions, people can say yes, yes, yes. But when it comes to the imbalance of power and or social status, that's where it gets tricky. And that's where often the argument that a particular conflict is bullying will fall apart. So if we could move into the next slide. I actually said this earlier. I should have put the slide in an earlier place. So this is just more about bias-based bullying, but I said it earlier. Last slide, please. So I said this already also. Please send the next slide. I forgot my order of slides here. Okay, this is the one I wanted to get to and to tie up with. When there is a lot of confusion about whether a situation is bullying or not, and if you were to go back through those 4 bullets on the earlier slide, often it turns out that the situation is not in fact bullying, but it more falls into the conflict category. So this little table, I think, can be helpful in sorting that out, whether it's intentional or not intentional, whether it's unprovoked or there's an equal provocation. Now, the reason I say usually is because there can be some circumstances where the bullying situation or what happens, let's say, is so severe that even if it's not repeated, if it has all of these other characteristics and it's not repeated, it could still be considered bullying. And that can sometimes be a judgment call. Is it serious enough that we still call it bullying even though it isn't repeated? And that may be a judgment call that adults need to make. And then the last point I want to make here is that the newest iteration of the ACEs scale now includes bullying as one of the experiences, traumatic experiences that young people may have. Conflict is usually not traumatic. It may be upsetting, but it doesn't have the long-lasting impact that a traumatic experience does. And I have worked with people in their 50s and 60s in adult training who can recall something that happened to them when they were 7, 8, or 9, so 50, 60 years earlier, and has impacted their lives in major ways. So I think that's a good place to stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Randy, and I want to thank both Kathleen and Brennan for their portion as well. So now I'd like to transition over to the Q&A portion of today's webinar. Again, for those attendees on the line, you can use the interface on the right-hand side of your screen to submit your questions. I see a lot of questions in regards to the recording. We will be sending out the recording of today's presentation as well as the slide in the next 24 hours. So you will have that as a resource. One of the other questions that has come up is in terms of the adult behavior in the classroom. So what do you recommend? And Randy, I'll start off with you. What would you recommend for adults or especially teachers who are not aware of their own negative example and impact to the students, or their behavior in the classroom may be negative or may encourage behavior that may exclude students or that may make students feel like they're being bullied, whether that's just through comments that the teacher is making in the classroom? How do you approach the teachers about this behavior? And also, what if the behavior continues, especially with teachers that are very liked by certain students or who have been around for a very long time?
Well, I think that adult behavior is a critical aspect of school climate. So in the broadest picture, if a school were to be doing a school climate survey and a bullying survey, but I think even more perhaps a school climate survey, while it might not identify a particular teacher who is behaving that way, there will be data that will show that that could be an issue. So that I would, and generally there's not just one teacher where that's a problem, because it's all, if the overall school climate and the norms are in opposition to that kind of adult behavior, then generally that person will stand out, and through, administrative and evaluation responses, that behavior would be changed. But if it's more prominent than one individual teacher, that's more likely to show up through a school climate survey, and perhaps even in a bullying survey if there is a question about adult behavior. So that's one thing. If it is really an isolated situation, then I think that's really an administrator and a supervisor, administrative supervisory role to address that. And that's where setting, goals for that teacher, having observations, watching the reports, encouraging students and or parents to to let the administrators know when those kind of experiences happen, and for students to report as well. So I think it depends on whether it's a single person or whether it's part of the climate or the culture of the school. And I've seen both. I have definitely seen both and worked with schools and I have coached school leaders to deal with those kind of issues. So it's a not uncommon problem.
Great, thank you so much. I have a question here from a therapist that works within the school system. She starts off first with a comment. It's really looking for some quick tips that you can take away from today, which is, her comment is, we see a lot of bullying, and I have seen responses from outright ignoring it by the school to a structured response, bringing both parents and the students in and discussing how bullying will not be tolerated. Without having these programs, meaning trainings like the one Brennan and Kathleen mentioned, in place at their school, are there any tips that you can provide the school for quick implementation that you found that works?
Are there any what that we can provide?
If they currently do not have a training in place for bullying prevention or nothing formalized, are there any quick tips that you can share for implementation on how to address this within the school that works beyond just training the staff or the teachers?
Yeah, I mean, you mean within like student to student, or we're still talking about staff to student?
Let's cover both for students and for the adults within the school.
I mean, I could speak to for New York City regarding the staff and regarding any teachers that are maybe even inadvertently offending or bullying children with their language or their ideas. I mean, there's many regulations in place to prevent that, and those same avenues that students or parents can use to report allegations of bullying could be used to report any misbehavior or any behaviors by staff members. Any allegations of bullying that involve staff members that we get in New York City, we forward to the OSI, the Office of Special Investigation, to pursue. But there's plenty of rules about corporal punishment and verbal abuse they're pretty strictly enforced. I think for all of it, the key, I think Randy mentioned it earlier, is relationships. I mean, in schools where the administration speak to the pedagogues and the teachers in a certain way, negatively, you see that same type of behavior passed on from the teachers to the students, and then from students to students. One method we've had success with in building empathy with students, where there's not, I mean, I think ideally you want to have some kind of formalized standard protocols across the school district or across the school system, but when that's not the case, one method for building empathy is role plays, to put students, to kind of switch roles, have students take the role of a bullied child or the child being targeted, or even the adult in the situation, and act out, and then stop during these role plays to ask pointed questions about how this behavior is making one party or the other feel. But yeah, ideally, you almost kind of need some sort of standardized protocols across the school district, I think.
So can I add something in here? I think that the question that you were repeating, Maria, is about when a bullying incident happens and the school counselor or therapist or the administrator is sitting with the student and the student's parents in kind of a conference situation. Is that what you were referring to in the question before? I just want to clarify if that's what you were talking about. Maria?
Happens, yes. In addition to that, what happens after an incident has occurred, and who is involved, who do you pull in?
I think what's critical is follow-up. So I think that the student who is targeted, as well as the student or students who are perhaps being seen as the aggressor or the perpetrator, whatever language you want to use here, there needs to be follow-up to be sure that it's not continuing. Often administrators, because they're so pressed, and counselors and therapists, because they're so pressed with so much to do, it's like, check off, I dealt with that incident, check off, I dealt with that incident. But in fact, it's the follow-up, which is part of the relationship point that Brendan was just mentioning, and that I keep emphasizing as well. Building a relationship actually with the student who is the aggressor may help to reduce that student's behavior. There can be lots of reasons why the student's behaving that way, and we haven't gotten into that in this webinar. But I think that that's a particular issue. So I think it's important to go beyond that initial meeting, which may be required, but may not be enough, and also to keep in communication with the target, because even after discipline against, toward the aggressor or the perpetrator, the bullying may pick up again. And so the target may say, oh, well, I tried reporting it once, I'm just going to put up with it now. So I think keeping on top of it is important.
Awesome. Thank you for adding on to that. With 1 minute left, I have a quick question for you, Randy. You mentioned a research center to visit for cyberbullying resources. Can you mention the name of the research center?
Sure. It's called Cyberbullying Research Center, and it's run by two terrific fellows. One, his name is Samir Hinduja, Hinduja, and Justin Patchen, Patchen, and it's the Cyberbullying Research Center. I don't remember what the website name is, but there is just a plethora of resources there. A lot. I've been interested in some of the research they've done on the connection between bullying and suicide, and specifically between cyberbullying and suicide. They do a lot of their own surveys, and it's just a great place. You could spend days going through their website.
Awesome. Thank you for that. We are at the hour, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I want to thank our attendees for spending the last hour with us, and our panelists for sharing all of this great information with our audience today. There's always an opportunity to continue the conversation, maybe a follow-up webinar. that we can schedule for early next year. But with that, thank you so much. We will follow up with a link to the recording and the slides. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and thank you for all of the great work that you're doing to support our youth out there. Thank you all.
Bye.